So, just a day or two ago, General Ben Hodges talked with Times Radio about how Putin is losing control of his warlords. And I'm going to play some of this for you. I'm not going to play the entirety of it, just a few clips with a little commentary to help you understand some context of what's going on. Anytime that you can listen to General Hodges, General Petraeus, Robert Gates, these are all excellent sources who can give you a wealth of insight. So here we go.
How do you see it? Do you see we're entering into phase 2.0 in this war?
I think right now is sort of the calm before the storm. The momentum has shifted so much to Ukraine's side. Ukrainians are preparing for a counteroffensive that we all think is coming soon. Every day there's new good news about countries like the UK, Germany, others wanting to provide resources to the Ukrainian side. And there's generally bad news almost every day for the Russian side.
And that's what you hear in Western news media, free media, as opposed to what you hear from Douglas McGregor or Scott Ritter, who will say one of two things. It's Ukraine's about to be destroyed. Or they'll say something like, Russia's not really fighting yet. I mean, if they were fully fighting, then it would be a whole different story. But they're showing restraint. No such thing.
I'm very optimistic about what lies ahead.
And recently this week, we've seen a new development. It is incursions into Russia itself in the Belgorod region. This is forces for the International Legion in Ukraine. What do you make of this exactly?
This is very interesting because there's 3 or 4 plausible explanations of what happened. Clearly, looking at the pictures of the aftermath, the Russians staged something to make it look like they had destroyed the entire incursion.
So he's confirming the same thing that we already knew, that Jake Bro went over, that other people have identified as not possibly being a legitimate site. And then RT ran with those pictures and talked about how they destroyed 70, and the people from the Legion were like, hey, nobody got killed. We all got back safely. What are they talking about?
Because these are Russian fighters fighting for the Ukrainian cause, but also to topple Ukraine.
Or else they are taking advantage of an opportunity fighting for their own cause. I would imagine that there is some connection with Ukrainian intelligence or something like that, but I can't tell for sure. And other than the distraction it causes for the Russian side, why would the Ukrainians do it? I see benefit for the Ukrainians, but I don't know for a fact that they have directed this.
We're talking about.
I think this is a distraction that causes problems for the Kremlin, and of course they have to explain it. And if this makes it more difficult for Russia to mass against Ukrainian forces,
right,
then I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, so he said two different things. There's a political poke in the eye that comes out of this, and so it doesn't look good for Putin politically, but it's also they have to pull this defense line back and actually deal with that threat. So it makes it harder for the Russians to be able to defend their positions as fully as they would otherwise be able to. So that's both correct.
We've been hearing for a couple of weeks now that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is coming. Is it coming? And when?
So General Zaluzhny, the chief of the general staff there, is an amazing soldier. I mean, he's very good. I've been impressed with their discipline. We know more about the Russians than we do about the Ukrainians, which is as it should be. But I think this counteroffensive, which everyone feels is coming, it'll happen when they're ready for it too. And I think he has 3 conditions. Number 1, are his own forces ready? Do they have enough strength, armored brigades that can penetrate on a narrow front the dense Russian linear defenses? That's one thing. And so all the work the UK has been doing, the equipment Germany's provided, what the US is doing in other countries, that's what's happening right now. I think they probably are just a few weeks away from being ready in terms of their own strength. The second condition, what about the Russian forces? Have they been degraded enough to give the best chance for Ukraine's attack to be successful? That means destroying ammunition, destroying fuel, creating chaos in the rear area. And then, of course, the third condition is the ground, the trafficability. Is the soil dry enough to be able to support the churn of hundreds of heavy tracked armored vehicles? When those 3 conditions are set, I think he tells President Zelensky we're ready to go.
Okay, so we know that they can't do it in the mud We know that. So that's the third condition. When they want to strike is going to depend on all the things that you've seen lately. The drone attacks going down to Sevastopol and the cross-border in Belgorod and all these other distractions are a way of spreading the Russians out so that they can penetrate through.
And how do you think that will be conducted?
Well, I think you're going to see what we would call combined arms, meaning mechanized infantry, tanks, engineers moving in armored vehicles, artillery and air defense moving along, overwhelming combat power massed on a very narrow front. They don't have to attack the whole 900 miles. They just have to get through these defenses to, I think, the Azov Sea coastline to cut the so-called land bridge. Well, this will be a significant increase in capability for the Ukrainian side. And of course, it's not just the airplane, it's the pilots, it's the system. Are they prepared to conduct operations, whether in support of ground operations or air-to-air, to keep Russian aircraft away, to sort of almost create like a bubble that pushes away Russia's ability to counter Ukraine's offensive. Now, obviously, we should have made this decision 8-10 months ago. We have F-16s from multiple countries being flown by Ukrainian pilots already.
Now, Robert Gates said the same thing. I'm going to do the same kind of thing with an interview with Robert Gates. He had like an hour and a half interview. I'm going to just do a few little clips. And he's saying exactly the same thing. We should have been doing this earlier. And that's because Putin has done a good job deterring the West by talking about red lines, by talking about nuclear saber rattling and that kind of thing. So we should have done it earlier.
We are where we are. It will still help in the next 3 or 4 months. And Ukrainians will always be faster than we think we are. They are proving this over and over.
Mm-hmm.
When they start having an effect in the next 3 months or so, if you're on the Russian side, you're like, doggone it. You know, we've been hanging on, waiting for the West to quit supporting Ukraine, and now this shows up. So that will have, I think, an important psychological effect in favor of Ukraine as well. Mr. Prigozhin takes no orders from the Russian General Staff. Shoigu, Gerasimov, he doesn't listen to them. He blames them when he doesn't get what he wants, or if it took so long to take Bakhmut. And I think his business model is to, okay, I'm done. I've done my part now. I'm going to take what I have left and go somewhere else.
So what situation does that leave the Russian forces in, who he says is going to replace them in Bakhmut?
Yeah, this will be interesting. These are forces that the Russians will have to find from somewhere else. Which of course is what Ukrainians want. The reason they fought so hard around Bakhmut was because, other than the fact it's a city of their fellow citizens, from a strategic standpoint, it was not vital. But when they see that Russia is willing to spend thousands of lives to take that city, then Ukraine said, okay, we'll do that, but without diverting our armored forces that we really need for the upcoming counteroffensive.
Now, Bakhmut's really interesting because Prigozhin has a victory, and then after his victory, if he walks away and the Russians backfill it, or the Russian military backfills it, and then something goes wrong, Prigozhin is even more of a hero. So his name is made already, and he could be even better. Like, there's no downside for him now that he has secured that victory. But the victory is, like, at what cost? And we don't know what the cost is. Of course, Colonel McGregor, I did a reaction video about him. He was talking about how, 100,000 Ukrainians were killed in Bakhmut. And I'm thinking, like, what are you reading? Where are you possibly getting that kind of figure? The Russians were on the offense, and there's basically a 3-to-1 offensive to defensive kind of just rule of thumb. The U.S. government saying that 100,000 casualties, both dead and wounded, and most of that from Bakhmut over the last 3 months. There's no way that you're going to have such a multiple from the Russians. But he gets it, and I've seen this in another place. History Legends. I might very well do one on History Legends as well. History Legends was talking about, like, showing here are all the companies or battalions that have gone into Bakhmut from the Ukrainian side. They must have hundreds of thousands of casualties. Yeah, but, just having these particular units go in doesn't mean that they haven't also rotated out. Like, you can't just assume that they were all killed in Bakhmut. So
you've already alluded to the state of the relationship between the head of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and the Russian generals. What do you think the relationship of the Wagner Group is with the Kremlin and with Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Kremlin?
There has to be some sort of confidence by Mr. Prigozhin that he's not going to be tossed out of a window somewhere. The fact that he's so publicly criticized in a veiled sort of way President Putin. But you know, these guys are like warlords. You've got Mr. Kadyrov, the Chechen. You've got Prigozhin with Wagner, and there are several other mercenary groups. And then you've got these so-called regular Russian forces. I think that all of them are trying to figure out how do they stay alive, and what's their status going to be when this war is over and Ukraine has won. Do they want to be the savior for Russia? Do they want to be the hero for President Putin? Or are they waiting for a chance to break away? I don't know how this is all going to play out. The good news for Ukraine and for us is that this incoherence and the hatred between the various leaders on the Russian side guarantees that they will not have a coherent defensive plan, and they won't be able to fight their defense.
that's exactly right. And I've said this before. I don't know whether it's worth a battalion or a brigade or how many, but their inability to work together has got to be degrading their military effectiveness. Now, my theory with Prigozhin, I said this in a different video, is that he's saying what Putin wants to be said so Putin can slap at his other generals or his oligarchs or whoever else. And he's doing it. He knows. I'm not saying that he gets a text from Putin saying, "Hey, say this." I am saying that he knows the boss well enough, or whatever it is, however he's worked it out, he's doing Putin's bidding. That's what I'm arguing, and that's why he's still safe. Now, if Putin decides that he's not doing that, he might have a different problem set.
That potential is there for them to be very successful. There's this thing: if you're not well trained and disciplined and confident, and you hear that the enemy has bypassed you or they're behind you, you panic. Russian defenders will break, because I don't think in most of these trench lines that the soldiers that are there sitting in those trenches and bunkers are well trained, confident, disciplined. And so the potential for this thing cracking open, I say potential, is very real.
But that seems like it'll be par for the course, given what the Russians have done from the very beginning. We thought they were the second army in the world, or they claimed to be the second best army in the world, and that's why it was so amazing when Volodymyr Zelensky said, "I need ammunition, not a ride," and I thought that he was signing his death warrant by staying in there, and the Ukrainians have proved that that the Russians are really bad. And not just that the Russians are really bad, but they proved that they're really good, and they self-organize, as Starsky talked about when I interviewed him. Like, Ukrainians are just, it's almost like an ant colony. They just self-organize and go and take that ground without having to be told what to do.
And to address how long this war will go on, there are some schools of thought that President Putin will try and spin it out for as long as possible, perhaps till after the presidential elections in the US. And then there are those that say that what he really wants is a settlement, a deal, a peace deal brokered by the US. Where do you think it lies, the truth?
His only hope, and I do mean the only hope that the Kremlin has, is for the West to lose interest or to get tired or to get distracted by something else. That's the only thing he can do. There is no other thing they can do to bring about a successful conclusion from a Russian perspective. And you're right. Of course, they know exactly when the American elections are, British elections are, Polish, and on and on and on.
Now, when I look at Putin, I think that Putin is trying to stretch it out. And the longer it goes on, the stronger the Ukrainians get. But the longer it goes on, this is Putin's hope as well, the greater the chance is that something could go wrong somewhere along the way that could allow him to seize on that accidental or just being tired or drawn out or whatever else. The longer it goes on, his hope is on a length of time, even though the Ukrainians are getting incrementally stronger as time goes on. It's a very strange thing to watch.
Fortunately, the U.S. election is 18 months away. Fortunately, the U.S. Congress continues to support this effort in a very, very strong bipartisan way. Stand fast. There are 3 or 4 loudmouths on both extremes. but by and large, the Congress is in strong support. So I think if my president, and I have not only great respect for my president, but also he's done a good job. And you got 50 nations sticking together, not just NATO nations, continuing to support Ukraine, but he has stopped short of saying exactly what the desired strategic outcome should be. And he also has stopped short of saying we want Ukraine to win. Instead, we say things like we're with you for as long as it takes. That's not something solid enough to generate the kind of support that's needed to bring about a rapid conclusion. If he were to say we want Ukraine to win, and then Prime Minister would say it, Bundeskanzler would say it, this whole thing could be over by the end.
Is that what you want them to do?
Absolutely. And this whole thing would be over by the end of the year. I mean, because then we would stop coming up with excuses why we can't provide ATACMS or we can't provide F-16.
Well, why do
Yeah, and this is the same kind of criticism that I talked about Lindsey Graham and Bob Gates, who I'm former Secretary of Defense and former head of the CIA, and I'll be doing a video about him very shortly. There's same kind of criticism, like speed up, guys. We want to get through this. Let's go. Let's support them. Let's give them everything we need.
you think there has been this delay, this hesitation in the provision of weaponry?
Of course, I have zero responsibility as an old retired guy, but the president does have a lot of responsibility, and so he has to be very thoughtful about the potential for Russia to escalate to use a nuclear weapon. I think it's exaggerated. I think there is about almost a zero chance of Russia uses a nuclear weapon.
But the threat of a nuclear weapon can deter the U.S., and he has done a great job. Putin has really done a great job deterring the West with the threat of nuclear war. So,
Of course, they have thousands.
But almost zero is not zero.
You're right. You're right. But if the United States and UK can be stopped from doing what needs to be done when any country threatens to use a tactical nuclear weapon, that's a signal to everybody else in the world that has a nuke or wants a nuke, like, well, we want some of that. So I think this is the place where actually we take a cold, hard look at this and realize there are zero positive outcomes for Vladimir Putin if they use a nuclear weapon.
now that last point, how we're instructing the world by how we go about supporting Ukraine is really critical, and I don't want you to pass that. If Putin can blackmail the West by saying we're going to use a tactical nuclear weapon if you do this, and they're successful, then what is to stop other countries from doing their level best to get nuclear weapons, and then even small tactical nuclear weapons, and then do exactly the same thing? It's the same reason that it's instructive to China if Putin gets hammered here to maybe that taking Taiwan's not such a good idea after all. So we have to keep the bigger picture in mind.
This is, when the Soviet Union made the decision to get out of Afghanistan, you didn't have all the nations of the world wringing their hands like, oh, we need to give the Russians an off-ramp. They just made the decision to leave because they don't have to worry a whole lot about public opinion. Yes, there were the mothers complaining about their sons being killed in Afghanistan, but that's different from a leader of a democratic country having to worry about what millions of people actually think. So an autocrat can always just say, all right, I'm changing my mind, I'm changing the narrative. And I think this is what could happen. I don't think the loss of Crimea equals collapse of Putin's regime.
The propaganda when Putin does that will be absolutely amazing if that kind of thing happens. We have declared glorious victory. We have taught Ukraine a lesson. Now we are withdrawing. I can't wait to see what happens in RT in Pravda when we get to that place.
What do you think is at stake in this war, and how well do you think the American public understand it and appreciate it?
Well, this is an excellent question. So far, I think most Americans instinctively feel like, this is Ukraine. It's not a perfect democracy, but they've only been at it for about 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
We've been at it for 250 years, and we're not perfect. So there is a sense of the little guy and Russia. Okay.
And I think that's a fair example or fair understanding of how Americans see that. And I'm saying that because about half my audience is American, British, or Australian, Canadian, and then the other half is European or other parts of the world. And that is how we think more than not.
International rules-based order.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that sounds like a political scientist.
This is important, though.
If you unpack it, we're talking about respect for borders, respect for sovereignty. That matters to every American. Respect for freedom of navigation, That's essential for our economy that depends on trade. Respect for human rights, respect for international agreements. Russia hates all that stuff. It's important for us. It's important for all of our European allies. And China is watching to see, are we really willing to defend those values?
And Putin really wants to overthrow, and he talks against the rules-based order. Who created these rules? All the time. You see it again and again in RT, Pravda, TASS, etc.
We don't show that we are willing to defend those values. What are the consequences?
And I think the chance of China making a miscalculation
That's right.
like Russia did goes up.
You're talking about Taiwan?
Yep.
Taiwan, South China Seas, a variety of other places.
Yep.
We don't have to have a conflict. It's not inevitable that we have a conflict with China. In fact, I think if U.S., Canada, Europe, our Pacific allies, you combine the economic power and the diplomatic power of all those nations, we can hold China accountable, force them to live up to the agreements they've signed, respect for sovereignty, international law. But if we don't, then they are going to continue seeking leverage in Africa, the Middle East, and other places.
Yep. So are you saying then that what happens in Ukraine will determine the future relationships
exactly.
with China?
You said it much better than
yep.
I did.
No, that's exactly right. And that is why Ukraine's important. I've said it before, but my values demand that I support Ukraine. That's just, my American values, my conservative American values. And I know many of you are liberal watching this, and your liberal American values are demanding that we support Ukraine. But there's a bigger picture. The rest of the world is watching.
I tell you I didn't. What do you think is the most realistic, the most credible, realistic possibility of ending this war?
That Ukraine liberates Crimea. Crimea is the decisive terrain of this war. Ukraine will never be safe or secure as long as Russia sits there, even after some sort of terrible negotiated settlement. They'll never be able to rebuild their economy as long as Russia can block all of Ukraine's ports from Crimea. So that's the key. That can be done. I believe that can be done by the end of this summer. But the key for U.S. now is not combat power. Our combat power, obviously, our job is to defend all of NATO territory. But what the U.S. Army in Europe is doing now with our German allies, our British allies, and others, this flow of equipment and ammunition that emanates from southeastern Poland and Rzeszów, it's incredible what they have done. It's astounding. I would be focused on making sure that was uninterrupted.
And
logistics wins wars, and that is exactly what the U.S. Army's role should be right now. They're not getting into a hot war. We're not trying to get into World War III. But the better logistics, the side with the better logistics, probably will win.
And did you ever envisage what happened in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea? And did you ever foresee what was going to happen now with this war?
I actually did believe this was going to happen. I didn't envision exactly how it was happening.
Why did you think that?
Well, because I could see. I was in the Army for a very long time, and you watch what the Russians are doing, and we failed to respond after they invaded Georgia in 2008. We failed to adequately respond after they supported the Assad regime.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking around. The U.S. Army was getting smaller in Europe. The British Army was almost completely off the continent back home. The German Bundeswehr was getting smaller. It had lost its edge. The Russians, in the meanwhile, were modernizing. And so while I overestimated Russian capabilities, things were going in the wrong direction. So in 2015, I did an interview with Wall Street Journal, and I said, I think we're going to be in a war in about 5 years. But that was just based on a practical military assessment and believing that the Russians only respected strength. And I was not very popular when I said that.
But he was right. He was right. Because that's how the Russians think. And we kind of lured them in, not like a sting operation, but by projecting weakness over time, getting smaller, the way we left Afghanistan, all these kinds of things, gave Putin the thought, I can do it. I'll get away with it. And they won't do anything about it. Sure, they'll protest, but they won't actually do anything. And he was dead wrong.
You're not in the army for popularity. You're there to try and make sure that you never ever have to fight a war by demonstrating that you're prepared. And yes, it is very expensive to do what needs to be done for effective deterrence. But look at the cost now.
That's exactly
Because
right.
this war is what failed deterrence looks like.
Yes,
And the cost.
yes, yes, yes. This war is failed deterrence. So now we have to look to the future and we have to think, okay, the world's watching. If we show them that we're supporting Ukraine, that we're all in right now, that is deterrence to prevent the next one. And that's the beauty of the way that Ben Hodges is thinking about it and the way that you should understand what is happening in Ukraine and why it's critical to be supporting Ukraine.
And then, of course, in the U.S., we were a mess. The former president denying he'd ever lost the election, January 6th, all of this embarrassing rupture in American society, plus the way the war in Afghanistan had come to an end. I mean, you could almost imagine the Kremlin saying, these guys they're not going to do anything. Germany was still building Nord Stream 2 up until late in 2021. So for me, this is the biggest lesson is that it's what we already knew. You can't appease when you're dealing with a brutal autocracy like Russia. They only respect strength. And I know I sound like a scratch record, but it's a fact. They've never been anything but an empire for almost 5 centuries. And until they are defeated on the battlefield, there will never be a reckoning. And whoever comes after Putin will be something like him, just with a less effective military.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's why this is important. The military analysis is great. I don't take that from anyone, but you have to get into the kind of the psychological profiling of the cast of characters and understand how culture affects the way that different nations interact with each other. And once you start to put those kind of pieces together, you have a clearer picture. It goes from like a Monet to a photograph in your understanding of what's going on. Okay, that's all for Ben Hodges. Thank you for your time and being willing to listen to what he has to say and your desire to understand as well. Thank you for the likes, the subscribes, the shares. Thank you for the coffees. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. I'll be back tomorrow, and I hope you will be too.